For most of our lives, the idea of a third world war, that was something for history books, right? Or movies. But that feeling is starting to change. What once seemed totally unthinkable has now become a mainstream and pretty measurable fear. So let's dive into it. And when I say measurable, I'm not kidding. Just take a look at this. Recent polls show this really sharp spike in anxiety. Nearly half of Americans now think a third world war is likely in the next 5 years. That's a huge jump from just 38% last year. This isn't just background noise anymore. It's a real shift in how people are feeling about the world's safety.
And this anxiety isn't just something the public is feeling. When one of the most powerful bankers on the planet, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, starts warning about geopolitical risks that we haven't seen since World War II, well, the conversation is getting very, very serious.
So, if a new world war is a real possibility, how do these massive conflicts even get started? Well, to understand what might be coming, we actually need to look back at the echoes of the 1930s. Now, let me ask you a question. When did World War II start? You'd probably say September 1st, 1939, right? When Germany invaded Poland. And yeah, you'd technically be correct. But the truth is, it's way more complicated than that. Great wars rarely just pop up on a single day. They build. And this is where we get to this really key idea of tributary wars. Think of World War II not as a sudden flood, but more like a giant river being fed by a bunch of smaller streams. All through the 1930s, you had Japan invading Manchuria, Italy invading Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War. Each one of these conflicts was like a tributary, pouring more and more instability into the world until eventually they all merged into the global disaster we now call World War II. And that brings us to a really, really sobering thought. Those conflicts were the foothills of the Second World War. The people living through them didn't necessarily see the mountain of war they were about to climb. So are the conflicts we're seeing all around the globe today, are they our generation's foothills? Are we standing in the same spot, watching a similar escalation without really seeing the full picture? Okay, so with that historical parallel fresh in our minds, let's turn our attention to today's global flashpoints. What are the modern tributaries that could be flowing toward a much bigger conflict? The first, and maybe the most obvious, is the war in Ukraine. Now, while the US has sent a ton of military aid, this chart is really telling. Europe as a whole has actually committed even more. And that's because for them, this isn't some distant war. It's existential. They see this as the absolute front line against an aggressive Russia that might just have them in its sights next. And this is where it gets more complicated, because this conflict is evolving. It's not just Russia versus Ukraine anymore. It's basically a full-blown proxy war. You can see it right here. It's almost a mirror image. While the West is sending Ukraine intelligence and military hardware, China is doing the exact same thing for Russia, supplying microelectronics, machine tools for tanks, even satellite imagery. The head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, he puts it pretty bluntly. He sees China propping up the Russian war machine, and in doing so, creating an alliance of authoritarian powers. We're talking China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, all increasingly lining up against the West. The battle lines are just getting clearer every single day. But it's not just Ukraine. Asia is an absolute tinderbox right now. You've got China's aggressive moves against the Philippines. You've got North Korea making new threats. You have the constant pressure cooker over Taiwan and simmering tensions on the China-India border. Honestly, any one of these could blow up into a much wider conflict that would almost certainly pull in the United States. Okay, so we've mapped out the conflicts, but figuring out the risk of a major war isn't just about looking at flashpoints. It's also about readiness. And when you start looking at the industrial capacity, the ability to actually build the stuff you need to fight a war, the numbers tell a pretty startling story. So there's this term that strategic analysts use, peacetime footing. What does that mean? Well, basically, it means your defense industry is built to be efficient, to work on a few high-tech projects at a time, not to churn out tanks and shells and ships for a massive long-term war. And according to reports, that's exactly where the US is right now. China, on the other hand, they're shifting to a wartime footing. To see what that gap looks like in real life, just look at this. This might be the most shocking statistic in this whole explainer. According to the US Navy's own estimates, China's shipbuilding capacity is roughly 230 times larger than America's. Let me say that again, 230 times. One of their large shipyards has more capacity than all US shipyards combined. It's It's staggering. And it isn't just about ships. While the US is struggling with its own critical programs, falling years behind schedule, China is methodically preparing for a long fight. They're making sure they have enough food and fuel to survive a blockade. They're trying to insulate their economy from sanctions. They're getting ready for the long haul. So you add it all up. The risks seem real, the historical parallels are there, and that preparedness gap is, well, it's stark. But maybe, just maybe, we need to adjust our mental picture of what a Third World War would even look like. I mean, when most of us hear World War III, our minds immediately go to mushroom clouds and nuclear winter, right? But what if the main event is something else entirely? Something that might already be happening? This quote from the BBC's veteran world affairs editor John Simpson just reframes the whole thing perfectly. He argues that World War III might not be some single future cataclysm. Instead, it's a process that's happening right now. It's a whole collection of moves, diplomatic, economic, military, that are already shifting the global balance of power and allowing authoritarianism to gain ground. And that's really the key takeaway here. The great conflict of our time might not be a single event at all. It might be this long, drawn-out struggle over the world's future operating system, a fight between democratic values on one side and authoritarian might on the other. And if you look at it that way, you could argue the war has already begun.